Most people who go missing in the California wilderness aren't lost. They just found something they weren't supposed to find. What you're about to hear are 15 first-person accounts from ordinary people who went into the backcountry and came back changed. If you are new to Park Ranger Files, welcome. Subscribe right now and hit the bell so you don't miss what we put out every week. Let's begin. Story 1. I want to be upfront about something. I work with my hands. I wire buildings for a living. I spend my days solving problems that have concrete physical answers. If the breaker trips, there's a reason. Find the reason. Fix it. Move on. That's how my brain is wired, no pun intended. I'm telling you that because what I experienced in the Trinity Alps 3 summers ago doesn't have a reason I've been able to find, and it's driven me a little crazy ever since. It was a 4-day solo trip. I'd done the area twice before with my buddy Crosby, but he had a new baby and couldn't get away. I knew the trails well enough to go alone. My wife Janelle packed my food, kissed me on the forehead, told me to text her when I got signal. Standard stuff. I parked at the Stewart Fork trailhead early Friday morning and was 2 miles in before 8 o'clock. The Trinity Alps are spectacular in a way that's easy to take for granted because California has so much spectacular wilderness that it blurs after a while. But that specific area, the steep granite, the clear lakes, the way the light sits differently above 6,000 feet, there's nothing like it. First day in, I felt the knot in my shoulders that had been building since March finally loosen. I made camp the first night at a small lake I'd camped at before with Crosby. Good spot, flat, sheltered on 3 sides by a granite ridge. I built a small fire, ate my dinner, went to sleep by 9. Perfect night. Second day, I pushed further east than I'd gone before, through a high pass and into a drainage I didn't have good information on. Not risky, just new terrain. My GPS was solid and I had it printed topo. I was fine. That's when I found the shelter. Not a maintained backcountry structure, not anything official. This was somebody's construction, deep in the drainage in a stand of old-growth fir. Rough timber, maybe 12 feet by 8, roof of layered bark and weighted branches. It had been built with real knowledge of construction. The joints were notched, not just lashed. The roof pitch was correctly angled to shed rain. This was not a casual effort. Whoever built it understood load-bearing and drainage and weather. Inside was a sleeping area, dry, with a bed frame made of lashed poles off the ground. 2 metal buckets, clean, a tin box secured with wire. I didn't open the box. Above the entry, carved into the header beam, was a date. Not recent. 1987. I photographed everything and backed out. Told myself it was a hunting camp. An old prospector's setup. Something historical that the Forest Service knew about or didn't. People build things out here. That happens. I camped 2 miles from the shelter that night on the high granite above the drainage. No issues. Good night. Cold. Stars absolutely packed the sky the way they do above 7,000 feet. Third morning, I broke camp early and started back through the pass. Around noon, I stopped at a stream crossing to filter water and eat. I'd been on the trail maybe 20 minutes when I got the feeling. Not a sound, not a sight. Just the full body, skin-tightening, stomach-dropping certainty that something was behind me and had been for a while. I've had that feeling before. Everyone who spends time in the backcountry has had it. Usually it's nothing, or it's a deer, or it's your own imagination working on the ambient quiet. But this was different in a way I still have trouble describing. It didn't feel accidental. It felt like a tension, like something very deliberately paying attention to exactly where I was and how fast I was moving. I stopped on a flat section and turned around slowly. Empty trail curving back through the firs. Nothing visible. I waited a full minute, watching. Nothing. I turned and kept walking. 10 minutes later, the feeling returned, stronger. I stopped again, turned. At the bend in the trail, maybe 80 feet behind me, a man stepped back, behind a tree trunk. Not fast. not running. Just stepping sideways out of my line of sight, deliberately, with the timing of someone who knew exactly how long they had before I would turn around. I saw him for maybe 1 second. Heavyset, dark jacket. No pack, I called out. Nothing. I stood there with my heart hammering for what felt like a long time, then I started moving fast. Not running, but a hard pace. The kind that puts miles behind you whether you want them to or not. I checked behind me every 30 seconds. I didn't see him again. I made the trailhead 4 hours faster than planned. I sat in my truck for 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. I called Janelle, told her I was coming home early. She asked if I was okay. I said yes, I didn't mean it. I drove back to Reading and spent the night in a motel. The next morning, I drove past the trailhead on my way home. There was a single truck in the lot, an older model Ford, no plates, just sitting there. I didn't stop. I haven't told this story to Crosby because he'll want to go back and investigate, and I'm not doing that. I have thought about that man stepping behind the tree many times, about the timing of it, about the precision required to know exactly when I was about to turn around. That kind of precision comes from practice. That kind of hiding comes from someone who has hidden many times. I build things for a living. I think about how things are constructed. That kind of tracking ability isn't built in a season. It takes years. It means someone has been in that drainage, following people, for years. Maybe the same drainage, maybe the same route, maybe the same approximate trail. Long enough to have learned the body language of hikers, the timing of their checks, the exact geometry of when they can be seen and when they can't. I don't know if that truck with no plates belonged to him. I probably never will. I've learned to live inside that not knowing. It's uncomfortable and I don't recommend it, but it's what I have. I have not been back to the Trinity Alps alone. Story 2. I study plants. Specifically, I study how coastal plant communities respond to soil chemistry changes in areas that have experienced landslide activity. That's relevant because it explains why I was in the King Range in late October, alone, in an area that doesn't get many visitors, with sampling equipment and a notebook, doing legitimate scientific work. I want to be clear about that because what happened to me there sounds like the kind of thing that happens to people who are doing something reckless. I was not being reckless. I was doing field work, and I still have no explanation for what I found. The King Range is one of those places in California that doesn't get the attention it deserves, probably because it doesn't have a famous name attached to it. But the Lost Coast section of it is some of the most dramatic coastal terrain in the state. The mountains rise from the ocean very quickly, the trails are primitive, and the weather can turn violent without much notice. I've worked there before. I know what I'm getting into. I was hiking a section of inland terrain about 3 miles from the coast, following the edge of a recent landslide to take soil samples. Good conditions, dry, overcast but no rain. I had 2 days of food and a camp already established at a flat area near a seasonal creek. The first anomaly was the smell. A distinct chemical smell, sharp and sweet at the same time, like something organic breaking down but faster than it should. I've smelled that in the field before, usually near standing water or heavy leaf litter. But here the terrain was dry and open. I noted it in my field book and kept moving. 20 minutes later, I found the clearing. It was roughly circular, maybe 30 feet across, and in the center of it, everything was dead. Not fire damage. The surrounding vegetation was healthy and the soil wasn't charred. But within the circle, every plant was dead, and had been for some time. The soil was pale, almost white, with a faint crystalline crust on the surface. I took samples immediately. I also took photographs. The boundary of the dead zone was sharply defined, almost geometric. You could step across it, and the vegetation went from healthy coastal scrub to complete death within a foot or two. No gradation, no transition zone. I spent about 40 minutes at the site, taking cores and documenting the boundary. I was genuinely excited. This was the kind of thing that makes a dissertation chapter. I recorded everything carefully and moved on. I came back to camp around 4, made food, recorded my field notes, felt great about the day. At some point after midnight, I woke up with a headache so severe that I was briefly nauseated. I've never had migraines, but I assume it felt something like that. I took ibuprofen and lay back down, and the headache faded over about an hour. In the morning, I noticed my sampling equipment. The sealed containers I'd put the dead zone soil samples in were sitting outside my tent, not inside where I'd left them, arranged in a line, spaced evenly, pointing north. I had not done that. I know I had not done that. I had stacked them inside my tent vestibule before I went to sleep, because I always keep my equipment inside or under the tent, not outside, because of moisture and critters. They were outside, arranged, pointing north. I packed them up, packed everything else, and moved camp 2 miles further along the ridge. I told myself I must have sleepwalked, that the headache was some kind of low-grade fever that affected my behavior. There was a rational explanation I wasn't seeing clearly yet. Here's the part I didn't include in my field notes, and haven't included in anything I've submitted to my advisor. When I analyzed the dead zone soil samples back in the lab, I found something my advisor described as anomalous and asked me to rerun. The crystalline crust material wasn't a natural mineral deposit. The chemistry matched a compound that my advisor, a 30-year soil chemist, said he'd never seen in field samples. He asked me where I'd collected it. I told him. He looked it up on the topo and then sat quietly for a moment and said, quite carefully, that he thought I should document the site with GPS coordinates and leave it for someone more specifically qualified to investigate. I asked him what kind of someone. He said he wasn't sure, but he didn't want me going back there alone. I have not gone back. I have the GPS coordinates, I have the photographs, and the lab results. I have a headache I can't fully account for, and equipment that moved itself 8 feet while I slept and pointed north. I'm still trying to decide what to do with all of it. Story 3. 30 years. Fighting fire in Northern California. I've been in every kind of situation you can imagine in the backcountry. I've cut line on hillsides that wanted to bury me. I've slept in my fire shelter and walked out through ash the next morning. I've packed out injured people, lost people. Once a body. I tell you this not to impress you, but because it sets the baseline. I'm not someone who rattles easily, and I'm not someone who misidentifies threats. When I say something was wrong in the Marble Mountain wilderness, I mean it was wrong in the same way a smoke column on the wrong side of the ridge is wrong. Your body knows before your brain can articulate it. I was up there for 8 days, solo. Second summer after I retired. My wife Connie wanted to take a cruise. I wanted to walk in the mountains. We agreed to both happen simultaneously, and we were both perfectly happy. I had a route I'd been planning for 2 years. High ridgeline, several lakes, minimal trail, mostly cross-country navigation. Exactly what I wanted. Days 1 through 5 were what I needed them to be. Hard terrain, good miles. The specific exhaustion that comes from using your body properly and sleeping at altitude. I felt like myself in a way I hadn't since I turned in my radio for the last time. Day 6, I dropped into a valley I hadn't planned to camp in, but chose because the light was going faster than expected, and I needed flat ground. Dense timber, dark earlier than the high country. I set up quickly, ate without a fire, turned in. I woke up at what I later calculated was around 2 in the morning. Not to a sound, to a smell. Anyone who has spent time in fire will tell you that your nose becomes something different after enough years. Mine woke me up. Something burning, not wood fire. Something else. Chemical, synthetic. The smell of something made by people burning. I unzipped and stepped outside. No visible smoke. The sky was clear. I walked a perimeter of maybe 100 feet around camp. Headlamp on, checking all directions. Nothing burning. The smell persisted for about 10 minutes, and then was gone. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. In the morning, on the far side of a log near my tent, I found a pile of ash, cold ash, as if a fire had been built right there at the base of that log and burned completely to nothing. Not a large fire, maybe the size of a dinner plate. The ash was fine and pale, and the ground beneath it was scorched in a clean circle. No fuel around it, no pieces of unburned wood. It had burned completely, precisely, and left nothing behind but ash. I know what fires look like. I know the difference between a controlled burn and a careless one, between old ash and fresh ash, between a fire that got away from someone and a fire that was deliberately made small and then deliberately extinguished. This was the last category. Someone had built a small, controlled fire within 40 feet of my sleeping position while I was asleep. I swept the area for tracks. The soil was packed and dry, nothing clear. I found one partial print in a soft patch near the log. The outside edge of a boot, large, recent. I did not alter my plan. I was a firefighter. Running from something I hadn't clearly identified yet wasn't in my conditioning. But I moved camp to a high saddle with 360 visibility, and I stayed at that elevation for the remaining 2 nights. Open ground. Nothing can approach you across open granite without being seen. Both nights were uneventful. When I got out, I reported the ash circle to the Klamath National Forest Service office in Wairika. The ranger I spoke to was younger than my boots and asked me a series of questions about whether it could have been a legal campfire from another party. I explained carefully that it was not. She took a report. I drove home and told Connie I'd had a great trip. She could tell I was lying, but she let it go. She's been married to a firefighter for 29 years. She knows the difference between a lie that's protecting you and a lie that's protecting her. I still go back into the backcountry. I go with Connie now, or with my former Captain Dressler, who retired the year after I did. I haven't been back to that valley. A small, deliberate fire built within 40 feet of a sleeping person is a message. I was a firefighter for 30 years. I know the language of fire better than I know most things. Fire's communication when it isn't accident. It says, I can get this close. It says, I was here while you were sleeping. It says, I chose not to let it grow. That last part is what sits with me on the nights I think about it. Choosing not to let it grow is a decision. Whatever built that fire and sat near my camp in the dark made a deliberate, considered choice to leave me sleeping. That choice could have gone the other way. It didn't. But the choice was made by someone other than me, in the dark within 40 feet of where I lay. That is the part I have never been able to put down. Story 4. My friend Cassandra and I had been planning the Desolation of Wilderness trip for months. 4 days, 3 nights, starting from Echo Lake and working our way through the lake basin. We both needed it. Cassandra had just gone through a difficult divorce, and I'd been working brutal overtime since flu season in January. The planning itself was therapeutic. We got matching water filters. We did shakedown hikes on weekends. We were prepared and we were genuinely excited. The trip started beautifully. Desolation in early August is breathtaking in a way that makes you forgive every sweaty mile it took to get there. The granite basins, the blue-green lakes, the space between you and the nearest car. We made good mileage the first day, camped near Lake Aloha, cooked a real meal over the stove, fell asleep listening to nothing. The second day was equally good. We saw other hikers, which we hadn't entirely wanted, but which in retrospect was reassuring. A family group, a few pairs of backpackers. Trail normal? Third day, the weather shifted. Not dramatically, just that particular cooling and thickening of the air that happens in the Sierra in late summer when afternoon storms build. We pushed our camp earlier than planned and got our tents up just as the rain started. Not a violent storm, just steady and cool. We each got in our tents and read and ate snacks and talked through the nylon walls. It was actually cozy. I felt happy. I woke up sometime in the night to the sound of someone unzipping my tent from the outside. I sat up so fast I hit the low peak of my tent roof. The zipper stopped. I said Cassandra's name, no response. I grabbed my headlamp and said, "Who's there?" No response. I held the zipper pull from inside and waited. Nothing. The rain had lightened to a drizzle. I could hear the small water sounds, the creek 100 feet away, a few drops coming off the tent fly. And I could hear breathing right outside, very close. I said Cassandra's name again louder. From the next tent, maybe 20 feet away. She said what? She sounded like I'd woken her up. I asked her to turn on her light and come to my tent. I heard her moving. Then her headlamp came on through the yellow nylon. Then she called out that she was coming and unzipped her tent. The breathing outside my tent stopped. By the time Cassandra got to my tent door, there was nothing there. We checked with both our headlamps. Empty campsite. The tent zipper, and here's the part I want to be precise about. The tent zipper had been moved 8 inches from where I'd left it when I went to sleep. Not all the way down. Not enough to open the tent. 8 inches. As if someone had started to open it, heard me wake up and stopped. Cassandra's not the kind of person who panics. She looked at the zipper, looked at me, looked at the dark around us, and said quietly that we were going to sit with our backs together until daylight, and then we were going to walk out. That's what we did. We sat back to back in the open, headlamps pointing outward, until the sky got pale enough to see clearly. Then we packed in silence and moved out. We didn't see anyone. We passed 2 northbound hikers on the way out around 8 in the morning and a couple, and I asked very casually if they'd seen anyone else on the trail. They said no, just us since the trailhead. I've been a pediatric nurse for 6 years. I work overnight shifts. My nervous system is calibrated for emergencies. I know the difference between fear that has a source and fear that's ambient. What I felt during those hours sitting back to back with Cassandra in the dark wasn't ambient. It was sourced. Whatever had been at my tent door was still nearby, just outside the headlamp radius. I could feel it the way you feel a patient who is close to crashing even when the numbers haven't moved yet. The room changes. The air changes. Something is working toward a threshold. We got out before whatever threshold it was got crossed. I have not gone back to desolation. Cassandra has been once with her new partner and 2 other couples. She texted me from the trailhead when she got out to say everything was fine and that she thought about the tent zipper the whole time. I told her I thought about it too. Neither of us has a better explanation than we had that night. Story 5. People who live in Los Angeles don't think of themselves as wilderness people. The city is too big, too loud, too present. The mountains behind it are a backdrop, the thing you mention when you're explaining the views to somebody from the Midwest. But I've been hiking in the San Gabriels since I was a teenager, and I know them the way you know a complicated person you've been friends with a long time. Mostly reliable, occasionally dangerous, full of history that most people never bother to look for. I teach history. I look for it. I was on a day hike on a Tuesday in October when the heat breaks and the chaparral smells like something finally alive again. My usual route, up through Eaton Canyon and onto a ridge I've used as a turnaround point for years. I've done this exact hike maybe 40 times. I know where the trail goes soft after rain, where the rattlesnakes like the sun in the late morning, where you can see all the way to the ocean on a clear day. It is the most familiar terrain I know outside my own neighborhood. I was on the descent, maybe 2 miles from the trailhead, when I saw the child. A girl, maybe 8 or 9, standing in the chaparral about 20 feet off the trail. She was wearing a school backpack, the kind with the molded plastic back panel and the mesh straps, the kind every elementary school kid in the county owns. She was facing away from me, looking out at the valley. I called out, "Hey, are you okay?" She turned around. The expression on her face was not distress. She wasn't lost and afraid. She was looking at me with an expression I'm going to try to describe carefully because I've been a high school teacher for 16 years, and I've seen every version of every expression a young person can produce. And this one I had not seen before. There was no surprise at my presence. There was no relief. There was a careful evaluating blankness. The way an adult who is very good at controlling their face goes neutral when they don't want you to read what they're thinking. I asked if she was with someone. She said yes. I asked where. She gestured vaguely back toward the upper trail. I said I'd just come from that direction and hadn't seen anyone. She looked at me without responding. I asked her name. She didn't answer. I said I could help her get back to the trail, and she said very precisely, "I know where the trail is." Something about the phrasing stopped me. Not what a kid says. Too crisp, too adult in its confidence. I stood there, trying to figure out what I was dealing with. She looked like a child. She sounded partially like a child. But the weight of how she was looking at me was not a child. I said I was going to wait with her until whoever she was with came back. She said that wasn't necessary. I said I thought it was. She looked at me for a long moment, then turned and walked further into the chaparral, away from the trail, downslope into heavy brush. I called out that she shouldn't go that direction, that the terrain was rough and there were rattlesnakes. She kept walking and was gone in about 30 seconds. I stood there. I called out twice more. No response. I pulled out my phone and called the ranger station. Told them a child alone, approximate age, school backpack, last seen heading downslope into chaparral east of the main Eaton Canyon Trail. They said they'd send someone to check. I waited 40 minutes at that spot before a ranger came up from below. He walked the area calling out, nothing. He asked me to describe again what the child looked like. I did. He said there were no reports of a missing child in the area. I said I understood that, but that I'd seen one, and she had walked into difficult terrain. He said they'd keep an eye out. I walked back to the trailhead and sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time. History teacher. I deal in documentation and evidence, in the record. I know what I observed. I know how children move and speak and look at adults. What I saw in the chaparral that Tuesday afternoon did not fully match any of those things. I teach American history. I have spent 16 years trying to help teenagers understand that the past is present, that the things that happen in places didn't stop happening just because we stopped paying attention to them. The San Gabriel Mountains have been inhabited for at least 8,000 years. The Tongva people, the Gabrielino, were in those mountains long before anything that could be called California existed. The chaparral holds its history the way good soil holds seeds. Under the right conditions, things come up. I'm not saying that's what I saw. I'm a history teacher, not a medium. I don't draw conclusions beyond the evidence. The evidence is that I encountered a child in the chaparral who moved and spoke in ways partially inconsistent with childhood, who disappeared into brush that would have been very difficult for an adult to move through quickly, who left no trace that search efforts could find. What it means, I genuinely do not know. I still hike Eaton Canyon. I scan the chaparral and the descent more carefully now than I used to. I haven't seen her again. I'm not sure whether that should make me feel better. Story 6. I work alone mostly, and I translate technical documents, legal texts, some literary work when I'm lucky, from German and Dutch into English. It's solitary in a way that suits me, but occasionally I need to be physically away from the desk and the screen and the sensation that my world is contracted to the width of a monitor. When that happens, I go to Point Reyes. It's close to where I live. I know it. The backcountry camping there is beautiful, in a wind-scoured, Pacific-facing way that's different from any other coastal wilderness I've been in. I've done 3 solo trips and several with friends. The 4th solo trip was last November. I had a permit for Coast Camp, 2 nights. Point Reyes in November is nearly empty. The summer crowds are gone. The rain hasn't fully started yet. The elk are active, and you can hear them bugling from miles away. I had the campsite entirely to myself both nights, which was what I wanted. First night was perfect. Wind off the ocean. Stars when the clouds broke. the sound of the surf a mile below as a constant background. I slept deeply and felt clean in the morning in the way that only happens when you've slept outside. Second day, I hiked north along the coast trail and came back to camp by late afternoon. I had a good dinner and watched the light go off the ocean and was feeling the particular contentment that comes from a trip going exactly the way it should. I woke up at an indeterminate time, late, full dark, to the sound of someone walking around my campsite. Not through camp, around it. Deliberate paced circuits. I could hear the footsteps clearly in the dry coastal grass, the particular crunch and swish of someone walking upright through that terrain. Not an animal. I've had deer walk through a campsite. I know what that sounds like. This was a biped, walking at human pace, making the circuits that a human being makes when they are circling something. I stayed very still and listened. The circuits were consistent, roughly the same path each time, varying only slightly. I counted 4 full circuits before I reached for my phone. Point Reyes has cell service in parts of the backcountry, patchy but present. I had a partial signal. I called the non-emergency ranger line, which is a real number that goes to a real person. A ranger answered. I whispered that I was at Coast Camp, and there was a person circling my site, and could they send someone? The ranger asked if I felt I was in immediate danger. I said I didn't know. They said they'd radio the duty ranger and someone would come. The footsteps continued for what I estimate was another 20 minutes. Then they stopped. I heard someone move away from camp in the direction of the coastal trail, retreating quickly, the footsteps getting quieter, and then nothing. 40 minutes later, a ranger arrived with a flashlight, having hiked the 3 miles from the Bear Valley Visitor Center at speed. She was professional and calm. She checked the perimeter of the campsite. She found what I'd found when I got up to look. A series of partial footprints in the soft soil at the campsite edge. Boot prints, adult male size, circling the site in a consistent path. She stayed with me until 4 in the morning and walked the trail back when it was light enough. She did not find the person. She told me, and I appreciated her honesty, that this kind of report was more common than the public knew. Not frequently, but regularly. Someone circling a solo camper site in the dark, sometimes multiple nights, usually gone before daylight. No confrontations on record at Point Reyes, but the behavior was recognized. I asked her what the behavior was called. She said they didn't have a specific name for it. She said some rangers called it watching. I've thought about that word ever since. Watching. The implication of that word is that the person doing it has chosen observation over interaction, that they want to see without being seen, that they derive something from proximity without contact, that what they want is not anything you have, just to be near you while you sleep. I don't know what is more unsettling, what they might want from contact, or what they seem to get from simply watching. I have not returned to Point Reyes alone. Story 7. I grew up in the Central Valley, and I've been doing seasonal work since I was 17. Harvests mostly. Almonds, grapes, stone fruit. It keeps me moving, and I like moving. In between seasons, I travel and I camp and I take the time I've earned. I'm not someone who had the money for fancy gear or planned trips. I go where the road takes me with what I have and I make it work. I was between the almond harvest and a crew job I'd lined up in Fresno. Had 12 days and about $400 and know where I had to be. Someone at the camp told me Joshua Tree was worth seeing if you hadn't been. I hadn't. I drove there in my truck, paid the entrance fee, drove past the campgrounds which were full and loud and not what I was looking for, and found a trailhead for a backcountry route that the kiosk sign said was lightly used. That was accurate. I went 2 days without seeing another human being. The desert does something different to you than the forest does. The forest closes in. The desert opens out. You can see so far that the scale of things stops making sense. The heat is brutal but honest. I liked it. Third night out, I camped in a sandy wash between two large boulder formations. Sheltered from the wind, flat ground, easy to get out of fast if I needed to. I've learned to think about exits since I started sleeping rough. It was around 2, maybe 3 in the morning. The desert at night is cold in a way people who've only been during the day don't understand. I was well insulated in my bag and sleeping fine. I woke up because someone was sitting at the edge of my camp. Not standing. Sitting. In the sand, maybe 15 feet from my sleeping bag, with their knees drawn up and their arms resting on their knees in the casual posture of someone who has been sitting comfortably for a while. The moonlight was strong enough in the desert that I could see clearly. A man. Older from what I could see. A hat, work clothes. He was facing me. I said, "Hey." He didn't move. I said, "Hey" again, louder. Nothing. I sat up slowly. My knife was in my boot, which was within reach. I got the boot and kept my eyes on him while I moved. He didn't react. He was just sitting there, watching me. I said, "What do you want?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. He turned his head slowly, not at me, but away from me, looking at the boulder formation to his left, as if he'd heard something over there, as if my voice wasn't the thing he was attending to. I stood up. He still didn't react to that. I said, "I've got a knife." He kept his eyes on the boulder. I started moving sideways toward my truck, which was maybe a quarter mile back at the trailhead. I had my sleeping bag and boots and nothing else. I moved fast without running because running felt like the wrong choice, like it would trigger something. I got to my truck, got in, locked the doors, sat there watching the dark where the wash was. Nothing came toward me. I drove to the campground, the loud one I'd passed on the way in, and parked in the lot and slept in the cab until morning. When the sun was up and there were people around, I went back to the wash to collect my gear. It was all there. Nothing missing. Nothing moved. The sand around where the man had been sitting. There were no impressions. No boot prints, no drag marks, no evidence that anyone had been sitting in that spot. I sat in the desert sand, and I looked at the place where a man had been 15 feet from me for what was probably more than an hour, and I could not find any physical evidence that he existed. I'm not an educated person, and I don't have the vocabulary some people use when they talk about these things. But I have slept outside in a lot of places, and I have learned to trust what my body tells me about other people in the dark. My body told me that man was real and present, and watching me for a long time before I woke up. What I think about sometimes is the posture of him. Knees drawn up, arms resting easy on his knees, not lurking, not concealed. Just sitting in the moonlight 15 feet from a stranger's sleeping bag. Like it was the most natural place in the world to be at 3 in the morning. Like he had as much right to that wash as I did. More, maybe, like I was the one who had wandered into his space and he was being patient about it. The desert in Southern California has been inhabited for thousands of years. That sand has held a lot of human weight over a long time. I'm not saying anything specific about what I saw. I'm just saying that a place with that kind of deep habitation doesn't empty out completely when the official history moves on. Something stays. I still travel. I still camp. I don't go back to Joshua Tree. Story 8. I need you to understand what my life looks like before I tell you this story, because the contrast matters. I manage a school of 400 students and 60 staff members. My days are structured to the minute. My decisions affect children and families in my community in ways I take very seriously. I'm an organized, responsible, grounded person who does not indulge speculation and does not tolerate drama. I have 2 daughters, a mortgage, a dog named Fig, and a Costco membership. I'm the most ordinary person I know. I also backpack solo every summer. Have done since my 30s. My daughters think it's the strangest thing about me. It's the 1 week per year that is entirely mine and I protect it fiercely. The Hoover Wilderness is High Sierra. Less traffic than the adjacent Yosemite, with the kind of terrain that requires real attention. I like the attention it requires. It takes everything my nervous system has and leaves nothing over for worrying about the school budget or the hiring process or the parent who's been sending weekly emails for 3 months. I was 4 days into a 6-day loop when I found the journal. It was sitting on a flat rock at a lake basin I'd camped at before, 3 years prior. A composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind. It was inside a plastic bag, sealed. It had been placed on the rock with evident care, centered, not dropped or left carelessly. I stood there for a long time. I've found gear left behind before. Water bottles, a hiking pole, once someone's entire bear canister with food still in it, probably dropped in a scramble situation. But a journal in a bag on a rock, placed like an object in a museum display, felt different. I opened it. The writing inside was meticulous. Small, very neat printing, filling every line of every page. Dates going back 8 months. It was a record of time spent in the Hoover. Multiple trips by the dates. Extended stays. The person who wrote it clearly knew this terrain very well, referenced specific landmarks by names I recognized, described campsites in detail. I read about 20 pages. I'm going to share a few things that I read because they're relevant. The writer described observing other campers from distances, watching families set up camp, watching solo hikers, describing their gear, their habits, their routines. The observations were written with the flat affect of someone recording data. No emotion, no stated intent, just documentation. On several pages there were crude sketches of tents, of people in profile, of boot tread patterns. On the last written page, which was maybe 2/3 of the way through the notebook, there were 2 lines. The first was a date. The second was a sentence. I have committed this to memory because I've thought about it every day since. It said, "The one at this camp, on this day, will find this when I'm somewhere else." I closed the notebook. I put it back in the bag. I put it back on the rock. I made camp on the far side of the lake at elevation where I could see the approach from every direction. I did not sleep. In the morning, I packed the notebook in my bear canister and carried it out. I submitted it to the Bridgeport Ranger District, which has jurisdiction in that area. A ranger called me 2 weeks later and told me they'd reviewed it and it was being handled. I asked if it was a law enforcement matter. She said she couldn't share details, but that they appreciated me bringing it in. I looked at the date on that last page of the journal many times. It was the day I arrived at that lake basin, not the day before, not a week before. The day I arrived. I have not figured out whether that was coincidence, which seems impossible, or prediction, which seems impossible in a different way. What I have figured out is that someone had been watching that lake for months, possibly years, that they knew people would come and when, and that they left documentation of their watching for the next person to find. I am a person who manages complex organizations full of complex people. I am comfortable with the reality that human beings are capable of a very wide range of behavior. But that journal reached the outer edge of what I can account for in my professional framework. I still backpack. I have not returned to the Hoover. Story 9. I see bad things regularly, and that's part of the job description. If you go into paramedicine expecting that human bodies will behave predictably and that emergencies will resolve themselves cleanly, you're in the wrong career. I went into it knowing that, and I've built the coping structures you build over years of doing this work. I've responded to every category of traumatic situation you can imagine in a 2-county service area. I have a good nervous system and good training, and I know how to manage myself in situations that most people couldn't handle. I'm telling you that because I want you to understand that when I say I was afraid in the Lawson backcountry, I mean it in a clinical sense. My body assessed the situation and flagged it as dangerous. That doesn't happen often, and it doesn't happen for nothing. I was on a solo trip, 5 days. Lassen Volcanic is unusual terrain, volcanic plateau, hydrothermal areas, forests and high lakes, all compressed into a relatively compact area. I've been going there for 6 years. I know the backcountry routes well. Third night, I was camped at a lake in the northern section of the park, away from the hydrothermal features, in standard forest and lake terrain. I'd had 2 perfect nights, and was relaxed in a way that takes most of the trip to achieve. I turned in early. At some point, I became aware that there was a sound outside my tent that shouldn't be there. Not footsteps, not breaking branches, a scraping sound, slow and rhythmic, like metal drawn across rock. Stop, metal drawn across rock, stop. Consistent timing, maybe 15 seconds between each repetition. I opened my eyes and lay still and counted repetitions. Got to 37 before I moved. I'm trained to assess before acting. I assessed. The sound was coming from the north side of my tent, the lakeside. The rhythm was too regular for an animal. The metal quality of the sound ruled out wood, ruled out most natural materials. It was continuous over a span of time that suggested intent, not accident. Whatever was making that sound was doing it deliberately and patiently. I turned on my headlamp, unzipped, and stepped out. A man was crouching at the lakeshore about 40 feet from my tent. He had his back to me. He was drawing something, long, slow strokes, across the flat rock of the lakeshore with what appeared to be a metal object. Not scraping in frustration or distress, carefully, methodically, like someone laying out a floor plan. He heard me step out and turned his head. I said, "Hey, everything okay?" He looked at me for a moment, and then looked back at the rock and continued drawing. Didn't respond. I could see in my headlamp that the rock was covered in a series of lines. Long parallel lines, crossed at intervals, like some kind of grid. I said hello again and asked if he needed help. He stood up. He was tall. He turned to face me fully and looked at me with the expression of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of something important and is deciding whether to address the interruption or return to the work. He said without any emotion, "Almost done." I said okay and stood there trying to figure out what I was dealing with. Medical situation, psychiatric situation, criminal situation. None of the categories was comfortable. He crouched back down and continued drawing on the rock. I watched him for another 2 minutes. Then he stood up, looked at the rock from a standing position as if inspecting it, nodded once and walked away. Not along the lakeshore trail, directly into the water, waded in up to his knees, then kept walking. The lake is deep at that point. I know the bath in Eerie. It drops off fast from the bank. Within 4 steps, he would have been above the waist. I called out. He kept walking. I called again louder, said stop, and told him the lake was deep. He kept walking and was underwater up to his chest, and then his shoulders, and then he was gone. I went in after him. I'm a trained water rescue responder. I went in up to my waist and swept with my headlamp and called out. Nothing. I waited. Nothing. I ran around the perimeter of the lake calling. Nothing came up. I called 911 on my satellite communicator, gave the location and the situation. Search and rescue responded. Divers were brought in the following afternoon. They found no body, no evidence of anything at the bottom in the area in question. No disturbance of the sediment consistent with a person going under. I know what I saw. I know what drowning looks like and how people move when they enter water in distress versus when they enter it deliberately. The man walked into that lake the way you walk into a room, purposefully. Knowing where he was going, the grid he drew on the rock was photographed by search and rescue personnel. Nobody I've spoken to since has been able to identify what it represents. It's still there, on that flat rock by the lakeshore. You could go look at it. I don't know if you should. What I come back to in the late hours after long shifts is a question I don't have a framework for. Where was he going? Not drowning, not panicking. walking into the lake with a direction, like he knew what was on the other side of the water. I still work EMS. I still do my job. I don't fish or camp at altitude anymore, and I probably won't again. The other hobbies are fine, and they don't involve lakes. Story 10. I write about science for a living. That means I spend a lot of time talking to researchers and reading studies and thinking about the difference between what we can demonstrate with evidence and what we believe without it. I'm good at that distinction. It's why I've been published where I've been published for 20 years. I don't overstate. I don't dramatize. I follow the evidence. I'm telling you all of that because what happened to me in the Ventana wilderness last year is something I'm still trying to run through that framework. So far, the evidence points somewhere I can't fully account for, and that is an uncomfortable position for someone who makes their living on the other side of that line. The Ventana is Big Sur backcountry. Steep, dense, genuinely difficult terrain that the coastal beauty of Highway 1 completely fails to suggest. The interior is old forest, dramatic ridgelines, and the kind of solitude that surprises people who assume the coast is always accessible. I've hiked it 3 times. This was my 4th. 3 days in, I came across another hiker at a stream crossing, a woman, roughly my age. She was refilling her water bottles, and I stopped to do the same. We made the standard hiker small talk. She'd started from the same trailhead 2 days before me. She asked which direction I was heading, and when I told her, she paused for a moment and then said carefully that I might want to think about a different route for the next section. I asked why. She said she'd come from that direction and that there was something there she didn't want to describe it accurately because she didn't think it would be useful. I pushed. She looked at me for a moment, measuring me, and then said, "There's a camp up there that isn't a camp." I asked her to explain. She said she couldn't, but that she'd turned back from it and added 2 miles to her route to go around. I'm a journalist. I went toward it. I found it 2 hours later. She was right that it wasn't a camp in any normal sense. It was a site in a clearing below a ridge, evidence of extended habitation, multiple fire rings, old and cold, a complex of lean-to structures, small, low, built with evident skill and long use, paths worn between the structures, and throughout the site, on every vertical surface, on every tree of significant size in the clearing, marks, carved or burned, symbols, shapes, lines. Not random. There was too much repetition for randomness. Certain shapes recurred dozens of times across different surfaces, inscribed by what appeared to be different hands at different times. Someone had been maintaining this site and these marks for years, probably decades. This was not a one-time construction, it was ongoing. I spent 40 minutes there. I photographed everything I could reach. I recorded audio of my own observations. I took several short video walkthroughs. I was on my way out of the clearing when I noticed the figure, standing at the far tree line, watching. Not moving, not concealed, just standing in the shadow of the trees at the edge of the clearing and watching me work. I lowered my camera and looked directly at them. They didn't move. I raised a hand. They didn't respond. I said hello. Nothing. I picked up my pace. I moved to the trail as efficiently as I could without running, and I turned onto the route and moved fast for 30 minutes before I stopped to check behind me. Empty trail. Here's what kept me up that night. The figure at the tree line had not been hiding. They had been watching me openly, without attempting concealment, which meant they were not worried about being seen, which meant either they thought I posed no threat, or they thought my seeing them was irrelevant to whatever they intended. I have covered stories about isolated communities, about people who live off-grid by choice or by circumstance. The site I found in the Ventana was the product of people who had been outside of ordinary social structure for a very long time. Not casually, fundamentally. My photographs came out correctly. I have the documentation. If you want to know where the site is, I'll tell you. Just know that someone is still there. Story 11. I take clients into backcountry water in Northern California and Southern Oregon. trout primarily. I've been doing it professionally for 10 years and personally since I could hold a rod. I know that country the way I know my own hands. I know where the fish are in every season, and I know the terrain. And I know where it changes from manageable to dangerous, and I know how to read weather at a glance. This is not a story about a client trip. This is a story about a day off. I was solo, no clients, no schedule, just my rod and my pack, and a lake I'd been meaning to fish for 2 seasons, but hadn't gotten to because client logistics always pulled me elsewhere. A remote lake above 6,000 feet in the Northern Trinity drainage. Not a secret listed on the maps, but the trail in is long and rough and most people don't bother. I got there early and had the lake to myself all morning, which was exactly right. Good fish, good light. The particular stillness of high water that goes flat and reflective in the middle of the day. I ate lunch on a granite slab and felt the fullness of a day with no requirements. Perfect. In the afternoon, a man appeared on the far bank. He hadn't come down the main trail because I'd have seen him. He came out of the timber on the far shore and stood at the water's edge. He was watching the water, not me. Standing completely still, the way you stand when you're watching fish in the shallows. I called across, "Good fishing day." He didn't respond. I tried again. Nothing. I watched him for a while. He didn't move. He didn't have a rod. He had no visible gear. He was wearing something dark and he was just standing there watching the lake. After maybe 20 minutes, I moved around the shore toward him, partly out of curiosity and partly out of the particular instinct of someone who spends a lot of time in remote water. Something felt off about a person standing that still at a lakeshore for that long with no equipment and no apparent purpose. By the time I got around to his side of the lake, he was gone. Not far away, gone. The timber came down close to the water on that side, and he would have had to go back into it. But I stood at the spot where he'd been and called out and got nothing. The soft soil at the water's edge showed no footprints from where he'd been standing. A person standing in soft, wet soil for 20 minutes leaves impressions. There was nothing. I've thought about this for 2 years, and the thing I keep returning to is the stillness. I guide clients through wilderness all season. I know what a person looks like when they're concentrating on water, when they're fishing, when they're bird watching, when they're just standing. This man's stillness was not the stillness of concentration. It was the stillness of something that doesn't need to move, because it is exactly where it means to be. The way a predator is still at a waterhole. Not passive, not resting. Present in a way that makes the air feel different. I fished until the light went, packed out in the last hour of it, and made my truck in the dark. Drove to Weaverville and had dinner at a counter, and told the woman behind it that I'd had a good day. I had a good day. I also saw something at that lake that I have not been able to make sense of in 2 years of trying. I still guide. I still fish. I haven't been back to that lake. Story 12. Medical school does something to your sense of time. The weeks blur. The caseload is constant. There's always more to know and never enough hours to know it. By the end of my first year, I was functioning, but barely. My friend group had contracted to 4 people, all in the same program, all in the same state. My roommate Deja told me I needed to go somewhere that wasn't the hospital or the library or our apartment. I drove up to the Angeles National Forest on a Saturday. Just a day hike, nothing ambitious. A trail I'd hiked once with my undergrad roommate 4 years before. Familiar enough to be easy, long enough to be worthwhile. I packed water and snacks and put my phone on Do Not Disturb and started walking. The first 2 hours were exactly what I needed. The forest in autumn does this thing where the light comes through the big cone Douglas firs at an angle that makes everything feel slightly unreal in the best way. My head emptied out. I stopped thinking about pathophysiology. I could feel the pressure leave my shoulders one step at a time. I was on the return leg, maybe an hour from my car, when I noticed the markers. At first I thought they were trail markers. Little strips of surveyor's tape, the fluorescent orange kind, tied to branches at intervals. But they weren't marking the trail. They were marking a path off the trail, into the brush on the downslope side, evenly spaced, leading away from the maintained path and down into a drainage I couldn't see the bottom of. I stopped and looked at them. The tape was new, bright orange, not sun-faded. Someone had put these out recently. I've been trained to observe. I noticed that the branch ties were at consistent height, about 5 feet, and on alternating sides of whatever path they were marking. Left, right, the way you'd mark a trail for someone to follow in low visibility. And I noticed that the marks led downhill into the drainage and there was no corresponding return path, no tape coming back up the other side. I stood there for a while. I am going to be a doctor. I thought about this the way I think about symptoms. What does this presentation suggest? Someone marked a path down into a drainage, one direction, recently, in terrain off the maintained trail. I did not follow it down. I took photographs of the tape from the trail, and then I kept moving. 40 minutes later, as I was approaching the trailhead, I passed a man coming the other direction. He was moving fast, backpack on, head down. He wasn't on a hiking pace. He was on a purpose pace. The kind of walking that has a destination and a reason. He had a roll of orange surveyor's tape clipped to his pack. I watched him pass me and kept walking. I got to my car and sat in it for a few minutes and thought about what I'd seen and what it added up to. A man with surveyor's tape moving purposefully up the trail in the direction of the markers I'd photographed. Markers leading down into a drainage with no return path. I sent my photos to the Angeles National Forest Ranger District and described what I'd seen. A ranger called me 2 days later. She asked for my full account. I gave it. She asked me to describe the man. I did. She thanked me and said they were looking into it and that I'd done the right thing by not following the markers. I asked her what the markers were leading to. She said she couldn't share details of an active inquiry. I asked if it was a law enforcement matter. She said again that she couldn't share details. I am going to be a physician. I deal in differential diagnoses. The most likely explanation for what I observed, from a purely observational standpoint, is not one I want to write down. I went back to my studies. I don't go to the Angeles alone anymore. Story 13. I spent 30 years as a postal inspector. Before you picture someone sorting letters, a postal inspector is a federal law enforcement officer. We investigate mail fraud, identity theft, violent crimes committed through the postal system, and a range of other federal violations. I have conducted hundreds of interviews, executed search warrants, testified in federal court. I know how to read people, and I know how to observe situations, and I know when something is what it appears to be, and when it isn't. I retired 4 years ago. My wife Paulette and I planned to travel, and we did some of that. But I also found that I needed something that travel didn't provide. Something physical and solitary. I took up backcountry hiking in my second year of retirement, and I've been doing it seriously since. I was on a solo trip in the Sequoia backcountry, 5 days in late September. Day 3, I was camped at a high meadow, well off the main tourist routes. Beautiful terrain. The kind of place that makes you glad you did the miles to get there. Around 7 in the evening before full dark, a man came into my camp from the uphill direction. He was young, maybe late 20s, clean-shaven, good gear, looked like someone who knew what they were doing out there. He asked if he could share the camp. I said sure. We made small talk over dinner. He said his name was Corbett. Said he was doing a solo traverse. Started from the road at the west end and heading east. The route he described was credible. I know the terrain. The distances he mentioned, the landmarks, the timing, it all tracked. But something was off. After 30 years of interviewing, you develop a sense for the person behind the story. The words can be perfectly accurate, and the narrative can hold together, and something about it, the way a person inhabits their own account, can still be wrong. Corbett's account was technically solid, but his eyes were wrong while he told it. He was watching me, not engaging with me the way a person engages when they're sharing their day, assessing, measuring, the way you watch someone when you're deciding something about them. I let it play out. I'm trained to let things play out. I turned in at my usual time and I lay with my eyes open. About 3 hours after dark, I heard him moving around. Not sneaking, just moving outside his tent. I waited, I heard him come around to my side of the camp. Then I heard the sound of my pack being handled. The top buckle, then the main zipper. I sat up, turned on my headlamp, and said, "Corbett, what are you doing with my pack?" He froze. The light caught him with my pack open, one hand inside. He was still for a moment. Then he straightened up and said he was looking for his headlamp, that he'd grabbed the wrong bag in the dark. Both our packs were on different sides of the camp. He was not confused about which was his. I said, "Okay, put it down," and kept the light on him. He set the pack down and went back to his tent. I sat up for the rest of the night with my knife in my hand and my pack under my sleeping bag. In the morning, he was gone before light. His tent was packed, no note. I checked my pack, nothing was missing, which in some ways bothered me more than if something had been taken. Because a person who goes through a stranger's pack at 3 in the morning and takes nothing is an after gear. I'm a retired federal investigator. The possibilities that sit with me from that interaction are not comfortable ones. A man who cases a solo camper, who builds a plausible cover story, who waits for deep night to access their belongings, who takes nothing physical. There are reasons for that profile. None of them are the kind I worked burglaries. They're the kind I worked the other cases for. I completed my trip. I kept a more aggressive security posture for the remaining 2 nights, and nothing further happened. I reported Corbett's description to the Sequoia Park Service on my way out. They logged it. I still go into the backcountry. I go prepared. I've never been a fearful person, and I'm not starting now. But I think about Corbett, about the careful patience of him, the good gear and the plausible story and the 3 hours of waiting in the dark. Some people who go into the backcountry are there for reasons that have nothing to do with the wilderness. They're there because the wilderness is where people go alone. Story setter Pat Smith. I've been running my shop for 20 years. Flowers, plants, event design. I love the work, but it is relentlessly social and relentlessly present tense. Every wedding, every funeral, every arrangement is happening right now for someone with feeling attached to it. It's beautiful work and it fills me up, but also empties me out. And every year I take a week where I go somewhere and I'm nobody's anything for a few days. Since the divorce, I've gone alone, which took some adjustment, but which has become, honestly, the week I look forward to most. I was in the San Bernardino National Forest, car camping with day hikes, not backcountry, just to be precise. My site was in a developed campground, not remote, not isolated. I had neighbors on both sides, normal camping, the kind that should have been entirely without incident. I woke up the second night to a sound I couldn't immediately categorize. A soft sound, close, repetitive. It took me about 30 seconds of waking up to identify it. Someone was humming outside my tent. Not a song. Just a single note, held and released, held and released. Quiet. Directly outside the mesh window of my tent. I sat up slowly, the humming continued. I could see through the dark mesh that there was no light out there. Just dark. But the humming was within feet of me. I said, "Who's there?" in a voice that came out louder and steadier than I expected. The humming stopped immediately. I heard footsteps retreating quickly toward the access road through the campground, then nothing. I turned on the lantern inside the tent and checked all the mesh windows. Nobody visible. I sat up for an hour listening. Nothing came back. In the morning, I checked with my site neighbors on both sides. The couple to my left had heard nothing and had slept through. The single man on the other side, who'd been up early, told me he'd seen someone walking slowly through the campground around 2 or 3 in the morning. He hadn't thought much of it. Nightwalker, he said, happens sometimes. He described a person moving slowly between the sites, pausing at some of them, moving on. I asked the camp host that morning if there were any issues overnight. He said no. I told him what had happened. He asked me to describe what I'd heard. I did. He said there had been 2 similar complaints over the past season, both from solo female campers, both involving someone very close to their tent at night, both of whom had also reported a voice or sound. One had reported humming. One had reported someone saying a single word she didn't catch through the tent wall. He said they hadn't been able to identify the person responsible. He said he'd add a note to my site's file. I asked him what that meant practically, and he didn't have a good answer. I finished my trip. Nothing happened the 3rd night because I left my lantern on inside, dimly, all night. Whether that was the deterrent or whether it was coincidence, I can't say. In 30 years of working with the public, in a shop where people come to me in some of the most emotional moments of their lives, I have developed a very calibrated sense for what people want from human connection. Whoever was walking through that campground in the dark, pausing at sleeping people's tents, making sounds just loud enough to be heard through the fabric, wanted something that I cannot categorize within the framework of normal human need. That profile, the deliberate closeness, the sound as contact, the retreat when named, that is not a profile I have a flower for. There is no arrangement for whatever that person was trying to get from sleeping strangers. I camp every year. I have a better setup now. I sleep lighter than I used to. I still go. I just don't go without knowing that the campground at 2 in the morning is not as safe as the daylight suggests. Story 15. I study mountain lions for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. That means I spend a significant portion of my working life in remote terrain, alone, tracking large predators, placing cameras, analyzing movement patterns. I am, by professional necessity, the kind of person who is comfortable in wilderness situations that would be genuinely alarming to most people. I have tracked mountain lions in the dark. I have been within 40 feet of an adult male puma, crouched in chaparral, and identified the situation correctly, and backed out safely. My threat assessment in wild terrain is, I believe, better than average. I'm telling you that because I want to be extremely clear about the following. What I encountered in the Los Padres last October was not a mountain lion, was not a bear, was not any wildlife species I have professional or field knowledge of. I have spent a significant amount of time since trying to identify it, and I am not able to. I was placing trail cameras in a remote section of the Santa Barbara backcountry, an area with documented mountain lion activity, standard field work. I was alone, which is normal for this kind of survey work. I had a radio, a GPS, a satellite communicator, all standard. I'd done this exact kind of work in this specific drainage 3 times before. The placement of the last camera took me about 4 hours into the drainage, in old-growth chaparral and mixed forest, at the base of a steep southwest-facing slope. Good habitat. I'd gotten good cat footage at a site about a mile up the same drainage the previous spring. I placed the camera and was on my way out when I found the first track. Mountain lion tracks are distinctive, and I find them often. What I found on the trail going out was not a mountain lion track. It was a handprint, a human handprint pressed flat into soft soil on the trail surface, facing my direction of travel, as if someone had crouched to the ground in front of me and pressed their palm down, fingers spread. Recent, the impression was crisp. I am a biologist. I documented it. I measured it. Large, male-sized hand. I looked around for other tracks. What I found upslope in a soft area between two large sandstone boulders was a set of prints, human, barefoot, very large, with an unusual gait pattern, not walking, not running. Something between the two, a motion that put the weight on the outer edge of the foot and the small toes, in a way I haven't seen in any human gait documentation I've reviewed. I followed the track line for about 30 yards before my professional judgment caught up with what my curiosity was doing, and I stopped. I was alone in a remote drainage, following unusual prints toward an upslope position that would have put whatever made them above me on a steep slope. Any apex predator trainer will tell you, do not position yourself below an unknown animal on elevation. My mountain lion training is explicit on this point. I reversed and moved out of the drainage at pace. Halfway out, I heard something on the slope above me. Not a crash, not the explosive movement of a startled animal. A careful, slow movement through chaparral brush, pacing parallel to me on the uphill side, at roughly my walking speed, matching my speed. When I paused, it paused. When I moved, it moved. The tracking behavior of a predator. I have been followed by mountain lions before. This is a documented lion behavior in areas where they have become habituated to researcher presence. I know what that tracking sounds like. The particular weight and movement of a cat moving through brush. This was heavier than a cat. The sound of bipedal foot placement in chaparral is different from quadruped, different contact timing, different rhythm. What was following me on that slope was moving on 2 feet. I did not run. I kept my pace steady and moved out of the drainage without looking up the slope. I got to the fire road and walked to my truck. I sat in the truck and documented everything in my field notebook, which I do after every survey regardless of what happened. I sent my documentation to my supervising researcher. He forwarded it to 2 other researchers in our network. None of them had an identification for the gait pattern. One of them, a veteran field biologist with more years than I have, sent back a single line response. Some things in the Los Padres are not in any catalog I have. I went back to that drainage 2 months later with a colleague. We found no unusual tracks. My camera had been rotated 180 degrees on its mounting tree. The strap was intact. The camera was not damaged. It had simply been turned around so it faced away from the trail, down into the brush. Something had turned my camera around to face away from itself. I'm still running that drainage in my survey rotation. I go with a colleague now. We document everything and we talk about it in the analytical language of fieldwork, and we do not speculate about what it is, because speculation without evidence is not how we operate. But I think about those tracks, the weight distribution, the gait pattern, the patience of whatever paced me out of that drainage on the upslope side. I think about it when I'm placing cameras. I think about it when I find footage with nothing on it in a drainage where I expected to find mountain lions. I think about it when a camera I've mounted carefully and precisely comes back pointed in the wrong direction. California has things in it that no one has formally documented. I am a wildlife biologist. That sentence represents a real and uncomfortable gap in what my profession can account for. I continue to work on it. If you have been somewhere in California and experienced something you can't account for, I want you to leave it in the comments below right now. Be specific. Location, what you heard, what you saw, what you found. The more detail, the better. This channel exists because people are willing to say what happened to them, even when they know how it sounds. And if your account belongs in a future episode, we will tell your story. And if you are not yet subscribed to Park Ranger Files, please subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Tell one person about this channel. Each of those actions is how we keep doing this work, how we keep collecting the accounts that don't go anywhere else, how we keep building the record of what's really out there in the wilderness that California's brochures forgot to mention. Go carefully. Know your exits. Keep your gear inside the tent. And whatever you hear moving in the chaparral at night, whatever's keeping pace with you on the slope above the trail, whatever leaves a single print in the soft soil and no other trace, don't follow it uphill. Good night.